Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Gray Matter. Today, we have a treat for you. We have another in a series of conversations that we've had along the lines of politics and culture, both globally and in Canada. As you know, we have been blessed on this program to have some of the really top public intellectuals, not only in Canada, but from around the world. These include Dr. Roger Hodkinson, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, Dr. Philip Salzman, Dr. Rodney Clifton, and more and more. And today, we have another such person, another person who is courageous and who has risked a hard-earned, very esteemed reputation to speak the truth about culture and politics and what is going on, the war that's being waged globally and domestically for really the survival of Western culture. And his name is Professor Salim Mansur. And so we're very excited to have him on the program. He's just finished an exciting speaking tour with Dr. Roger Hodkinson that was conducted in British Columbia, and he's going to talk about that a little bit. But his introduction is going to take a little bit of time because he's very accomplished. He's done many things, and he's also a widely published author. And what's more, he's a controversial figure, and we love those on this program. So before we get to him and introduce him properly, as we always do, we're going to go to the aphorism board. And of course, these have been selected somewhat in his honor, and hopefully these don't offend him too greatly. I doubt that they will. The first one is from Winston Churchill, who said this about Islam. He said, "Individual Muslims may show splendid qualities, but the influence of their religion paralyzes the social development of those who follow it. No stronger retrograde force exists in the world." The second is from Angela Merkel, the former head of the German state, who said, "This multicultural approach, saying that we simply live side by side and live happily with each other, has failed, utterly failed." The next quotation is from a man named Jack Kelly, who is an American public intellectual, who wrote that multiculturalism is social poison. Toleration of intolerance isn't sophistication, it is suicide. And finally, from former presidential candidate, and now I believe a member of the US Senate, Mitt Romney, "The multiculturalism movement must be unmasked for the fraud that it is. There are superior cultures, and ours," talking about the Western culture, "is one of them." So there's a broad spectrum of comments about multiculturalism. Why are we talking about multiculturalism? Well, we happen to have an esteemed expert in multiculturalism on the program today. And so we want to pick his brain about this and many other things. So we have today Professor Salim Mansur, who is a PhD. He specialized his focus on international relations and comparative politics with special interest in the politics of South Asia and the Middle East. He's done a lot of work on the subject of Islam and Muslims examined within the context of 9/11 and its consequences. And he's worked on a related project that looks at the imperative of Jew-Muslim reconciliation by rethinking Islam and Muslim culture and politics. He's a professor emeritus at the University of Toronto. And as we said, his research interests have drawn him into the areas that we've described. He's also published a few books. In 2011, he published a book called Delectable Lie, A Liberal Repudiation of Multiculturalism. In 2009, he published another book called Islam's Predicament, Perspectives of a Dissident Muslim. And back in 1994, he published another book called The Indira Rajiv Years, The Indian Economy and Polity, 1966 to 1991. So we're going to dive into some topics with him right away. But before we do that, I want to start off our conversation with Salim by quoting from Justin Trudeau, and hopefully this is going to trigger Salim. Justin Trudeau said this. He said, "Many immigrant families I met in Papineau," that's his writing, "brought with them lingering animosities from their country of origin. But they accepted that Canada was a place where people come to escape old world feuds, not to nurture them. So what does multiculturalism mean to these people and to me? It means a presumption that society will accommodate forms of cultural expression that do not violate our society's core values. These include the right of a Jew to wear his kippah, a Sikh to wear his turban, a Muslim to wear her headscarf, or a Christian to wear a cross pendant. So, Salim, first of all, welcome to the program. It's great to have you here. It sounds to me like our Prime Minister is about as profoundly ignorant on the subject of multiculturalism as he demonstrates him to be in almost every other subject, particularly academic ones. What's wrong? What, in your opinion, is the fundamental problem with multiculturalism, and particularly as it operates within Canada? This idea that we could all sort of live adjacently under one roof. Is Angela Merkel correct when she says that this is a failed experiment?
She did. Angela Merkel was right, but she is the one who became also the instrument of making the situation even worse during her last years in office. You know, her decision to open up Europe to this wave of migrants and immigrants from the Middle East and Africa coming through across the Mediterranean, and the implication of all of that that has led to what, for instance, the British author in his book, Douglas Murray,
Strange Death of Europe.
The Strange Death of Europe, you know, and listed it, you know, multiculturalism, Islam, and so on and so forth. So the issue is, Leighton, if I may call you Leighton, if that's okay.
Absolutely, please do.
Thank you. The issue is, in discussing any of these concepts, ideas, ideologies, is how do you define it? What is the definition? What is the premise from where you begin? I mean, you know, multiculturalism has been presented and sold as motherhood and apple pie. Who can be against motherhood and apple pie? I love apple pie. You know?
Who doesn't? Especially with a slice of cheddar cheese.
Precisely, you know, precisely. So, so we have to get back to the basic, and I wrote the book about this, going back to the basic. You know, when the current Prime Minister's father introduced the word multiculturalism into Canadian politics, you have to go back to early 1970s in the context of the election of 1972, where he lost his majority that he had won in 1968. And that's the backstory. So what did he mean by multiculturalism? It was a policy statement, and that policy statement eventually became a political idea defining Canada as a multicultural society and multiculturalism. And eventually, under Brian Mulroney, it was put into a statute, the Statute on Multiculturalism, 1986, I think it was, if my memory serves me right, in his first term in office. And eventually, it is now in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Section 27, you know. But none of this has been defined. So here is the problem. Or we have to ask ourselves, what is the standard by which all cultures are deemed equal? Because that's the idea. You have to treat, you know, people of different cultural background with the different baggages of culture that they come with or they bring with them to a country such as Canada or Europe, United States now. And these cultures have all to be taken and seriously taken as equal and respected. So then what is the standard? And the standard is not given. You know, and I asked this simple question about what is the standard on the basis of which one deems a culture that has put man on the moon and decoded the genome code as equal to a culture that embraces the idea of genital mutilation, does not recognize male and female equality, or is a culture with a several thousand-year history of caste system, which is where I was born in India, you know, and that struggle in India goes on even as I speak right now, and so on and so forth, you know. And the answer is, there is no answer, because it is an absurdity to suggest that all cultures are equal. So Canada as a society was founded, and the founding culture is intimately bound with the history of Christendom of Europe. Mm-hmm. It's the first European settlers who came to North America, and then what eventually became Canada, and then the United States. This is the cradle of the Western Christian civilization that has gone through its own unique historical development over, at least half a millennium, if you don't want to go back too far, So in this period of time, say from about approximately 1600, what do you have? You have this whole Reformation, Counter-Reformation, preceded by Renaissance, and then the Enlightenment age in political development, in industrial and scientific evolution, in the changes that have been wrought and the struggles that have been gone through in creating what eventually became, particularly in the United States, the expression of an Enlightenment age, which is found in the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. How is this culture, therefore, same? I would say, to my culture, I would leave aside any other one, the culture into which I was born. 250 years of British rule of India transformed over 5,000-year-old civilization into the world's largest democracy. You take away that 250 years of British rule, and this is not a defense of colonialism. We are looking at it objectively. Mm-hmm. India is not would not be the world's largest democracy. Mm-hmm. So these are the discussions that needed to be had. In other words, Canada is a multi-ethnic society, not a multicultural society. And to talk about multi-ethnicity is not only good and positive and proper, it is the objective reality. Canada is an open society, an open country that embraces open migration, into which people like myself and others have come, found our shelter, found a refuge, found our, sense of purpose, in which we have been able to build our own lives and contribute to the country that I hope we have contributed, but as part of the unique culture that is Canadian. Mm-hmm. And multiculturalism makes a dog's breakfast out of it. So the father began with multiculturalism is all cultures are equal, and the son ends up with the bracket that Canada is now a post-national state and has no core identity. A country or anything without a core identity, which is a vacuum, can be filled in with, it is a void that can be filled up with any garbage, that one wants to fill it with. And that's exactly what has happened to our country. But because it is politically incorrect, and let me make one final note on this matter. Why is it that in this period of multiculturalism that begins in the 1970s and 80s and gets sharpened and deepened with the principle that is pushed through our universities, our schools, and our institutions, including our courts, that there is one political way, a correct way to express yourself? That is exactly censoring speech. This culture, fundamentally, is a culture based upon freedom as individual rights. And if you're going to, suffocate, choke the freedom to speak, to think, to articulate your thoughts and writing, then we're back again in the very struggle which began with, say, John Milton in the 16th century, writing Areopagitica and demanding freedom of speech. And throughout this period, the struggle for freedom of speech. Of course, in the American Constitution, it is the First Amendment right protected, but we don't have it anymore. So that's what multiculturalism has brought us to.
That's a fascinating. You've connected a lot of dots there about, you're almost describing multiculturalism as a type of Trojan horse. I saw, Salim, a piece that you had published some years ago entitled Multiculturalism, What Does It Mean to Be a Canadian in the 21st Century? It's a very fascinating piece that sort of pulled out perhaps part of the essence of your most recent book, Delectable Lie. But you said this, you wrote this: the question before us, I take it, centers on how we relate to the idea of multiculturalism, whether we see it positively in terms of the first principle of liberal democracy or negatively. The first principle of liberal democracy is about individual freedom and the rule of law designed to protect it, while liberalism is an ideology, as the economist and historian of ideas Robert Heilbroner noted, supporting a system of perfect liberty. So that book was published 11 years ago. So, and it was somewhat prescient. So how, I want to ask you a couple of things. How is this concept of multiculturalism connected to the concept of liberty, or disconnected from it? And how was it that you were able to foresee this 11 years ago, to see where we are now, where, for heaven's sakes, we've got a shop teacher in Toronto wearing 80-inch prosthetic breasts and wearing a miniskirt?
Well, I mean, coming from the background that I come, Leighton, I was a young man just out of my teenage years that I arrived in Canada as a war refugee out of circumstances of war and genocide. But the larger picture behind me is the history of India. I just mentioned India is, the world's largest democracy. If we now extend the definition of multiculturalism that Canadians have adopted and put it on India, then India is the most multicultural society in the world. Each of the linguistic ethnic group as a cultural entity is larger in terms of population and number than Canada as a country or any of the European countries. India is about 1.3 billion people. And if you take in the country that was broken up in 1947 into Pakistan and India, and you add the numbers there, then India is, and Pakistan and Bangladesh and Nepal and Sri Lanka, which were all part of the one British India, now is about 1.6, 1.7 billion people, And if multiculturalism is imposed upon it, then the argument becomes that each of these subgroups or segments, if they engage in self-determination, they would be countries, as I repeating myself, larger than Canada. And this has happened. India has been, in that sense, gone through a situation where sub-ethnic groups have sought some sort of autonomy or independence from India, and India will fragment. India doesn't claim to be multicultural. It claims to be multi-ethnic. And in that sense, India is like the United States, e pluribus unum, from many one, because the concept of being an Indian in the context of this tremendously diverse culture of religion, languages, and history means that India is many nations. But out of many nations and people, there is now one India, which is, again, I go back, is the legacy of British rule. And I see that as a positive way. So given that history, and given what I was watching and experiencing in North America over the years that I've been here, it's almost going to be 50 years next year that I've been in Canada. And 9/11 was the cutting point when all of this exploded upon us, even though I was speaking about this before 9/11. I tried to explain the problem that we are going to be confronting. And it is so. The problem that I anticipated has come to haunt us in far more amplified form, because it has now takes in the whole question of gender problem, which was what we were not talking about in the 1990s and the early 2000 years. So I wasn't surprised. I anticipated that this would happen. And the big question is why? My answer, getting into that big question, is, and it's not only my answer, it is the answer I share with, for instance, Samuel Huntington. You possibly are familiar with the writings of the late Professor Samuel Huntington of Harvard University, and also Arthur Schlesinger Jr., the late Professor Arthur Schlesinger Jr., historian of Harvard University. Both had written about multiculturalism in their own different ways. But Huntington pointed out that it is the elite in America, and he was talking basically upon America, and I would say it is the elite in Canada and elite in Europe, who have now abandoned their own people and their own culture and their own nation state, and they want to be cosmopolitan. They have now transcended. They are not Canadians, as Trudeau makes the case, and he is pretty, whether he has thought this matter through or not is besides the point. His words, if you take it seriously, is pretty clear. It's unambiguous. It is Canada as a post-nation state or post-national state, and there's no core identity. So Mr. Trudeau is a man of the world. He only happens to be the Prime Minister of Canada, that we have elected. And this is exactly what the situation is in the United States, particularly with the Democrats and the left, against which the movement of President Trump now represents, make America great again, or what we are now seeing in European politics. I mean, the recent election, in fact, this week, only 2 days ago, of the incoming new Prime Minister of Italy and the party that she will represent, is unabashedly against this concept of leaders and political thinkers who now think that it is their duty to represent the entire world and not Italy or Netherlands or Canada or United States. And so Samuel Huntington called them very correctly rootless cosmopolitan. They're cosmopolitan and they're rootless because they're not rooted in any culture, in particular the culture into which they have been born and which, as political leaders, they're sworn to protect. And so they've abandoned that, and this is the result that we're happening. So you look at the whole panoply of events of the last decade or last 2 decades, you see that there is a systematic, this is a deliberate, in my view, demolition of European culture, of which we are an integral part as Canada, as the United States. And at the heart of the European culture, of course, is the history of Christendom. This is a direct assault on Christian faith, Christian culture, Christian identity, and then everything else. And how do you do that assault? You open the gates of this culture to embrace or to invite or to bring in just about everyone from all the other cultures, in which then what was the defining culture of Canada, United States, Europe, becomes mongrelized to such an extent. It is like adding water to wine. And at what point does the wine is no longer wine? It becomes water. A mismatch of a liquid that has no further identity. That's exactly what is happening and what the World Economic Forum and the globalists are up to. So when Justin Trudeau says Canada is post-nation state and Canada has no core identity, and in 2018, just before the 2019 election, goes to Morocco to sign the UN Compact on Global Migration, he's precisely following the globalist agenda. The Chinese are not signing that migration, UN Compact. The Indians are not signing it. The Filipinos are not signing it. But why is it the European Union is signing it? And why is it being pushed in the United States? Which is now what we are seeing happening, So these are events, issues, phenomena happening not in a void. It's happening in real time with real consequences, with really thought out policies whose consequences have already been thought through and accepted as this is the way they want to go. That is the globalist one. And Mr. Trudeau is just an instrument of that globalist agenda.
That's a very interesting comment. I heard Dr. Jordan Peterson probably had the best description of our prime minister when he said that Justin Trudeau is simply a mouthpiece. He's simply a medium for a message. And this is why, for example, when you see him when he's engaged in question period, where he doesn't respond to questions, he simply repeats talking points. And so that's fascinating to hear your take on that. Speaking of our prime minister, the Canadian government's made a recent announcement. I'm sure you heard about this, where they will be providing more than $600 million over the next 5 years to bail out the country's financially strapped media outlets. So this is the purchase of the media. And this was part of a fall fiscal update about the federal budget ahead of the 2019 federal election. And of course, we've seen this continue and go on and on. Can you describe sort of how this type of, let's call it champerty or infection of the private media to pronounce and to promulgate these concepts of, these globalist concepts like multiculturalism, how they're connected to this overall agenda?
Well, as I have expressed myself already, I mean, the multiculturalism as a tool is to subvert, dilute, and dismantle the founding culture of Canada, the founding culture of the United States, and Europe. What you're referring to, the $600 million that was put out just ahead of the 2019 election, is very clear. I mean, the people who will take the money will then abide by the government's policy or the policy that is being dictated out of Ottawa. And that's exactly what has happened. People are going to be deplatformed. People are being deplatformed. Universities, are being forced to follow the direction or the ideas that come out of the university. The ideas didn't come out from, farmers in Alberta, or in Saskatchewan. These ideas came out from the ivory towers. And so the universities and colleges are the first instances where these ideas have been put into play and thought through. I mean, I have my colleague at Western, for instance, Professor Julie Pones, who's a tenured professor and a professor of ethics, was laid off because she chose not to go along with the mask and vaccine mandate. So again, the proximity and the coming together, the convergence of all of this, I mean, is, again, I would say, looking back upon it, I mean, we can only understand history in hindsight, retrospective. We can draw connections on it and explain it, that these are not accidental. I mean, what happened in 2019 in the election, followed by the whole pandemic, which basically is a total fraud if you want to get into examining it in terms of number and history. But these were used for specific purposes and is being used for specific purposes. And the specific purpose is the WF agenda. I mean, it has been stated, it is written down. We can only open up and look at it, what is happening. But I quickly want to make one point, and before it gets lost in this discussion. Sure. It is very easy to critique and dismantle the Liberal Party, because the Liberal Party has been the national governing party in Canada through the last century, the 20th century. 75 years out of 100 years in the 20th century, the Liberals ran the show in Ottawa, and pretty much they're going to possibly do the same now in the 21st century, or what remains of the 21st century. But it is also the role of the other party, principally the Conservative Party. They are part and parcel of the globalist agenda. They have not stood up. I mean, we have had in the 20th century only one basically Conservative prime minister, that's Stephen Harper, for a decade. 2006, 2015. And we had, in the second half of the 20th century, after John Diefenbaker, one other conservative prime minister, progressive conservative prime minister, that is Brian Mulroney, in 1993. If you look at the record of these prime ministers, that's on the conservative side, and their caucus, and go all the way back to, say, Robert Stanfield, who was hoisted upon the Conservative Party by backroom boys like Dalton Camp and company, after they took out John Diefenbaker. You look at what they stood for and what they spoke about, or what they didn't speak about. It is the silence that says much more. It's like the Sherlock Holmes dog and the hounds of Baskerville that did not. Right. Where was Robert Stanfield when Mr. Pierre Trudeau pushed the policy of multiculturalism? He jumped on it. His silence was an indicator that they will go on, because they didn't have the conviction or the courage to oppose Mr. Trudeau. Where was Mr. Mulroney on this matter, and just subsequently on all other matters, that has happened? And now we come to, in the 21st century, post 9/11, to Harper, tenure in government, and the people around Harper. He was the prime minister who came from the West, from Alberta, ostensibly, with a clearly defined agenda, which he inherited as an Albertan from the Reform Party. He was a part of the inner circle of Preston Manning in the Reform Party. And so you go back and ask yourself, what happened to the reform agenda? What happened to the agenda which has had a resounding victory today in Italy with this woman leader, Giorgia Meloni, God, church, and family. That's her trinity, and she has spoken out boldly about this through the campaign. Well, that was, in a sense, also the Reform Party agenda. It was, as the very name Reform Party indicated, it was a reform that was far overdue of the Canadian society and the Canadian constitutional arrangement. Whether we talk about the EEE Senate, whether we talk about balanced budget, whether we talk about equalization payment, whether we talk about paying down our debt, whether we talk about tradition and family. The roots of the Reform Party was in religious and social conservatism. Well, what happened? Mr. Harper simply, as a good Pontius Pilate, washed his hand out of the entire agenda. I asked my conservative friends, give me an indication, one indication in the 10 years of Harper's regime that he stood for anything that is conservative value and legislated, which he had inherited as a reform member. And there's nothing. Nothing can be pointed out, In 2005, the Same-Sex Marriage Act was passed. Mr. Harper had the opportunity to speak to that issue when he became the prime minister, even though it was a minority government. Where does his party stand on this matter? He was totally silent. He was totally silent. In fact, he forbade anybody to speak about. We are the only G7 country that has no law on unlimited or in whatever aspect a person wants to go through abortion and a woman wants to go through abortion. We have no law. We have no limitation. As Maxime Bernier said, technically an abortion can be performed right at the moment of birth, because there's no, and Harper would not discuss it. So this is not simply a liberal problem. It is our country's problem. It is our political leadership problem, and we are forbidden to speak about it. That $600 million that you refer to would take all of this into account, but it was specifically mentioned in the UN Compact on Migration that any discussion on the question of aspects to deal with multiculturalism, ethnic values of the migrants is forbidden. And they would then, the people doing that would be taken into, again, a sort of a cultural revolution type of school, the Maoist school, to be, rehabilitated into what is the official agenda, and therefore politically correct speech. And the whole item was listed. So 50 years of multiculturalism has brought us into a situation where we have embraced the China way, as the Chinese are struggling to break out of the China way. That's the paradox.
Yes, and it's fascinating in that people have different ideas about the leader of Russia, Mr. Putin, but not long before the war was declared with Ukraine, he was being asked about wokeism, and he sort of chuckled. And he said, "Yes, we've been through that before." Exactly. And so what I think he correctly identified this wokeism, if we can call it that, this global agenda, as indistinguishable from the Marxist period, the Leninist period that the Russians went through. But Salim, I want to ask you about, you mentioned about the Conservative Party, and I know in your history, you had an experience where you were essentially ostracized from the party for things that you made. You offered expert opinions because obviously you are an expert in the Muslim religion and culture, and you spoke out. There was a piece that you wrote that I saw called "How Salim Mansur is Trying to Clarify the Theories and Inner Conflicts That Have Shaped Islam," and you were described as a dissident Muslim, but you were given the label Islamophobic. Why did that occur, and what did you have to say about this idea about the inner conflicts that have shaped Islam?
Well, I think you're referring to some of the reviews of my book that was published in 2017, at the end of 2017, The Quran Problem and Islamism. And I've been working on this matter. I'm working on another manuscript. I don't know when I'll finish it, but I'm working on the on a sequel to that, The Quran Problem. And in a nutshell, let me put it, because this is a vast subject, and this is a subject that the common people, the lay people in the West, non-Muslim, have very little understanding about, or the understanding that they have come from little pieces of blurbs and statement made, as you quoted Churchill, and so on. And then with a broad brush, the history of a civilization is taken into account. It would be as if, we take the history of Christendom, say the period of Inquisition that ran from the reconquest, as it is called, of Spain in 1492, the year Columbus set sail and discovered the New World, and which then carried on for a couple of centuries, and then say Christianity is nothing but Inquisition. In a way, that's what Albert Camus said. Albert Camus, the great French writer and Nobel Prize winner, said or wrote that religion is not politics. And if it is, then it is nothing but Inquisition. Religion has always been, used as a handmaiden of politics all the time. One cannot separate the two. But religion is not politics. It is, it is a way to ascertain our understanding of values that transcends our world in the physical world. It is a matter of faith. It cannot be, proven mathematically 2 + 2 is 4. So whether it is Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, and so on and so forth, it is a matter of faith of the people who are born into that faith or who want to maintain that faith. Islam today, and has been for the past several centuries, going through an upheaval, an internal upheaval, and the internal upheaval has become deeper and more acute in the 20th century, coming into the 21st century, just as the Christian world, Christianity, in the period, say around about 1500 onwards to say 1800, went through massive conversion, the religious wars of Reformation and Counter-Reformation. And to understand that, so Christianity was used, or Jesus was used. I mean, Martin Luther is just one name of hundreds of names I can cite. So the point I'm getting at, we are, that is the Muslim world, is in a state of an upheaval. And that upheaval brings together, it's a convergence of modernity, modern values, modern understanding, modern science, to a people who are, in a very large sense, I'm talking about the vast majority of people, the Muslim world is about 2 billion people, from Indonesia to Morocco, who are in a pre-modern society. And the society is, evolving as a process into the modern age. And that's what we see. Afghanistan, for instance. So that was my very first objection to the idea of multiculturalism. How can these cultures be considered as equal to a Canadian culture? It is an absurdity. And I'm a Muslim speaking. I'm not saying that, I'm speaking here, without any background or understanding, We have immense problem. But are these problems directly to do with Islam or understanding of the people with Islam? And that's a debate that is going on inside. And so people have to understand that. 9/11 happened. Who did it? Who are responsible for it can only be understood if you provide the context. Without the context, there is no history. And so, one has to discuss the context. I mean, today, I came back 2 weeks of my travel through the interior of Alberta and BC, and it is a fascinating developments that are taking place. But if you simply talk about it in the absence of context, people who are not Albertans, people who are not from that part of BC, whether in Canada or outside of Canada, will have no clue. We'll have no clue how is Arthur Pawlowski, a Christian pastor today, elected as a leader of the Independence Alberta movement. In one sense, it's an oxymoron. In another sense, it is real, because the only person, as I can see now, looking out real time as things are evolving, that there is possibly nobody in Alberta who has the credential and the credibility and the courage that Pawlowski has as he confronted the COVID mandate, as he confronted what is happening, that is the assault on the Christian civilization and the Christian churches in Alberta by political leaders who come from a Christian background. And so what is evolving in Alberta will have what is happening in Italy, God, church, and family. It will have the same resonance. And so then will the non-Christians say that what is happening in Alberta is violent, is vile, is unacceptable? Of course they will say that if they have no context of understanding. And that attack is going to come because there are people who are opposed to what the Independence Party of Alberta stands for, what the Alberta Prosperity Project has been articulating over the past, several months or several years. I am a pretty well-informed Canadian from central Canada. I was not fully aware of APP because, again, the $600 million boondoggle that Justin Trudeau paid out to the media, to which the Conservative Party are fully complicit in it, basically whitewash or obscure the story of Alberta. If I talk about Alberta Prosperity Project in central Canada, people will stare at me with glazed eyes. What am I talking about? So this is again in real time, and so the question of Islam and the question of Muslim in real time is also a very, very complex history. And what happens, Leighton, again, in real time with real people, is that prejudice or bigotry is nothing but ignorance, you see?
Right.
And when people are not willing to engage in an informed discussion, they spout smears and vilification. In my travel through Alberta and BC, I ended almost all of my formal speaking and then was open discussion by simply asking the people, because I was discussing the issues of World Economic Forum, I was discussing the issue of the past few years and how it has impacted on Canada and Canadian. And I asked people, I concluded by saying, I will simply request that you follow the greatest advice of the greatest philosopher ever, and that is Jesus. Take the beam out of your eyes. We are always so quick to go taking, the mole out of the eyes of our neighbor. Take the beam out of your eye. So the Muslim societies, whether it is Middle Eastern, whether it is South Asian, whether it's Southeast Asian, and into Central Asia and Europe. I mean, what the war that is taking place in Ukraine. People are talking about Jews of Ukrainian background. Nobody's mentioning Muslims of Ukrainian background because, Crimea was part of the Ottoman Empire that was then taken over by the Russian Empire. There's a very large segment. In fact, in terms of numbers, there are more Muslims in Ukraine than there are Jews. But how many people know that? And similarly, across the Russian Federation, the Tatars, the Don Cossacks of Volga, Muslims who either converted to Christianity or who remain Muslim, and today they're part of the Russian Federation. Russia is a multicultural society. That, if you take it in the Canadian definition, but they don't take it in Canadian definition, they talk about multi-ethnicity and multi-religion, and Putin has talked about that. So back to the question that we are confronting with, we have basically, I repeat myself, made a dog breakfast out of not only our history, but world history. History is not taught in university. Political discussion takes place with blinkers and political correctness. And what has happened is we have and we are losing our sense of who we are. You have, for instance, in Alberta, same as in Ontario, in a deeper sense. But let's take Alberta. You have the Lieutenant Governor General of Alberta now, Salma Lakhani, who's an Ismaili Muslim. You had the mayor of the largest city in Alberta, who served for, I believe, 2 terms, if not more, Nahid Nenshi, who's an Ismaili Muslim. And he has been succeeded by a woman, Ms. Gondek. I'm forgetting her first name now, or as I speak. She is a Punjabi Sikh. Now, I present these 3 evidence to you as an Albertan, and I would like to know from you, was a due diligence done before these appointments were made of who they are, what their interests are, and what their background is? Because I don't know the particular stories, but I do know the larger history, the backstory from where these people come.
So no, it's a great question. I think the consensus is that both the mayors in Edmonton and Calgary are the product of the Liberal government in Ottawa spending a lot of money to help them get elected. And so that they were, I won't say that they're puppets, but they're certainly acolytes of the federal government. Of course, the mayor in Edmonton was a former Liberal cabinet minister. I would call him a failed Liberal cabinet minister. So that's probably the answer. But it is strange, isn't it, that Alberta, which is a province where that is going through, let's face it, a nationalist movement. The mayors of the 2 largest cities are really products of this sort of multiculturalism. I want to ask you though, Salim, on this topic of Islam, there's a recent story that they came out in the news in Alberta, where there was a group that actually was successful in getting the Human Rights Commissioner for Alberta removed. And do you see that as an example of sort of the weaponization of multiculturalism, sort of the really sharp edge of the knife, where multiculturalism is doing damage, where let's face it, religious radicals of any stripe are able to actually remove high-ranking public officials on the basis of an alleged slight or an insult? Is that part of the danger of this multiculturalism that you've been talking about?
I think we have gone past the expiry date. It's not only a real danger, the danger is an operation. It's happening.
Okay. Yeah.
Remember, I mean, we go back to early 2000, that's after 9/11. There was the Muslim organization or Islamic organization in Alberta and Calgary who brought cases against Ezra Levant and Mark Stein. If you remember, it was in the Human Rights Commission on the basis of hate speech. And subsequently, when the gentleman, his name was Sarawardi, Imam Sarawardi, and his group realized that I've written about this extensively in my book on delectable law. I realized that the matter is not going to end up simply with a decision in the human rights court. It will go further on into appeal process and into a regular court, not a kangaroo court. They dropped the cases and they and walked away without any, liabilities on their part of having ruined or brought problems to Mark Stein and Ezra Levant. I believe that Ezra Levant was out of a considerable amount from his pocket and trying to defend himself in right court. And by the way, the same or similar organization in Ontario wrote to my university, University of Western Ontario. I am at Western, not Toronto. I did my graduate studies at Toronto. They wrote a similar letter alleging that my writings, my speaking are hate speech, and that I need to be fired from the university, or that they would take me to the court. And I went through both in my own private situation, talking it over with my family, my wife and members, and then my friends, because I was ready to go to court if they were going to take me on, on this matter. It was the president of my university, Professor Paul Davenport, who basically dismissed the Canadian Islamic Congress letter sent against me, similar letter as Ezra Levant and Mark Stein, saying that I am fully protected under my tenureship and under the Charter of Rights, freedom of speech, and so on. And I think what happened was, Leighton, is that Canadian Islamic Congress withdrew pursuing the case with me because they were concerned about the optics if they took me to the court, and I was prepared to go to the court. What would be the optic with the Islamic organization charging me in whatever manner they wanted to charge me, whether as a heretic, an apostate? I've been called heretic and apostate, on hate speech, and that would have been an interesting case, if they had taken me there. But they dropped it. And they went with this, with Ezra Levant and Mark Stein, and then eventually dropped it. And so what you're referring to is happening. And this is, again, part of the calibrated and planned way to demolish any questioning and opposition to the gutting of the founding culture of Canada. Now, the founding culture of Canada does not have to be only defended by a white Caucasian. The founding culture of Canada has universal value. And I embrace it, as Filipinos embrace it, as Vietnamese embrace it, as people from Hong Kong embrace it, because we all want to see that this fundamental value in the American context, that all men are created equal in the language of 18th century. All men are created equal and endowed by their creator with rights. And among those rights are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is a universal creed. This is a universal doctrine. And we all wanted, or at least those of us who understand, we wanted, and we not only wanted, we wanted to be robustly defended and protected. And what has happened, as Huntington explained, the ruthless cosmopolitan, of which Mr. Trudeau is a prime example, and all the people around him are out to gut and demolish. So what you are indicating is happening in Alberta, and these appointments that are taking place is really a stab in our face, because these are the people who are not going to defend it. They will be used to dismantle it. Give you another example. Right now, as we're speaking, real-time example. The big tech in America, the Google, the Facebook, and so on, Twitter, who have they deplatformed? Who have they censored? I mean, you and I'm a nobody. They have deplatformed and censored President Trump. And then when they were questioned, when the president and CEO of Google was questioned about this, I'm forgetting his name, he's a man of Indian background, he said, he laughed, he said, we don't recognize First Amendment. What the heck are you doing sitting in Silicon Valley as the CEO of an American organization? But you see, they have now parceled off the fundamental issues of the American Constitution, and similarly of the Canadian Constitution in Canada, to people who have no regard, total disregard, because their background is not, one that was brought up in this culture or which they have grasped hold of, and they're totally dismissive of. And you have now appointing, this is being done by the Liberal, this is being done by the Conservative. But it is being done without due diligence. I'll give you, I raised the question, so I'll give it to you.
Sure.
Ismaili Muslims is a sect within Islam. Islam is today, it has its fundamental divide, just as in Christianity, the fundamental divide, theologically speaking, is between Roman Catholicism, and Protestantism, going all the way back to Martin Luther. And then on the other side is the divide, Roman Catholicism and Orthodox Christianity, the Eastern rites, which is Russia now, the Patriarch in Moscow, or used to be in Constantinople. In Islam, the fundamental divide is between Sunni Muslims. They are the vast majority. 85% of the Muslim world is Sunni. That is, they follow the way. The word Sunni technically means the way of the Prophet. And then there's Shia Islam. Iran is the principal exponent of Shia Islam. Historically, going back to the Prophet's time and afterward, Shia means that they follow the Prophet, but they identify with the family of the Prophet Ali and follow that way. And this is the historic schism within Islam going back to the 7th century. Now, within Shia Islam, there are many, many sects. And Ismaili Muslim is one sect, just as among Protestants, there are, say, the Seventh-day Adventists, the Mennonites, and so on and so forth, So this is a very small group of people. Its numbers is in the range of 15 million. And they follow the Aga Khan. The Aga Khan is the spiritual leader of Ismaili Muslims, Prince Karim Aga Khan. Now, Prince Karim Aga Khan is now deeply involved in Canadian politics. And we can go back and look at this historically. You have the current prime minister sitting with 3 conflict of interest, violation by the person responsible for ethics and morals. And yet the Canadians don't care and they have voted for him. Well, his first violation was traveling to the island of the Aga Khan. The second violation had to do with SNC Lavalin, and the third violation was with his support for We, that organization, engaged in various activity that remains clouded. So the Aga Khan is a man without a country. He's not a political head. He's a spiritual head in that sense, just like the Dalai Lama of Tibet doesn't have a country, but he's spiritual leader of the Tibetan Buddhists. And he goes about and he meets the people who are in exile in the diaspora, and they follow him. They follow his rulings and his commands and so on and so forth. So the Ismaili Muslims follow the Aga Khan and their ruling. The Aga Khan became a very close friend of Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And it was that friendship that led to Pierre Elliott Trudeau in the early 1970s opening the door to Canada for the Ismaili Muslims from Africa who were being expelled by Idi Amin of Uganda, if you go back to those early decades and violence and so on. So a huge number of migrants and immigrants from Africa of Ismaili background found a way to Canada. and they have been very successful in the sense of business, in the sense of education, in the sense of professional roles they have played, and they have been, remarkable success. But here comes the politics of it. The Aga Khan is a dyed-in-the-wool globalist. His entire family, his younger brothers and cousins, have been deeply involved in UN affairs. And his grandfather, who was the first Aga Khan, was a product of the British in India. So this is deeply, deeply enmeshed the history of the British rule in India and in Africa, where the Ismailis were living, or where they grew up, where they were born, scattered population, the diaspora, just like the Jewish diaspora. And so now they have come to Canada, just as I came, and others have come. But the difference is, in the most critically important way, that they will follow the commands of the Aga Khan. The Aga Khan was made the honorary Canadian by whom? By a conservative prime minister. There are 5 honorary Canadians in Canadian history. Mandela was one of them. Raoul Wallenberg is one of them. Aung San Suu Kyi of Burma is one. The girl who got the Nobel Peace Prize, Malala, is one. And Aga Khan is the other. So there are 5 honorary citizens. It is the conservative prime minister who made this Aga Khan the honorary citizen. Ask yourself why. That will open up a whole host of Pandora boxes. Because you have had critical assistants, political lackeys, that have been brought into the federal government by both the political parties and in provincial governments and in municipal governments of Ismaili background, who are going to follow as Canadians when it comes to making decisions as Canadians, but will carry the interest of what the Aga Khan dictates to them openly or within their own format, in their own forum, So there you have this now. You have Naheed Nanshi, who was the mayor. You say the Liberals paid or helped him. Whether the Liberals did or whether the Conservatives did is immaterial. They are not part of it. You had the Premier of Alberta, whose executive assistant was an Ismaili Muslim. When he was the Minister of Immigration and Culture in Ottawa, it was an Ismaili Muslim, And a person like me, who have been writing and talking about this with all my faults and flaws, and I will confess them if anybody wants to do it, as being a human being, I was called an Islamophobe and expelled from the party when I sought the nomination on the encouragement of my friends for the 2019 election. And why was that so? Why I am an Islamophobe that was expelled, and the Islamist agenda is now fully penetrated in the Liberal Party and in the Conservative Party and in the NDP. As we speak right now, the Liberal government has a caucus of Muslim parliamentarians who are heavily influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood. Of course, they're going to engage in deniability if they're questioned, but those who know about this understand very well. I mean, motion 103 was presented, that is the motion that declaring any discussion of Islam as Islamophobia after the 2019 election, was moved by this woman, a member from Mississauga, Ikra Khalid, whose entire connection is with Muslim Brotherhood. We have a federal cabinet member sitting in the parliament whose connection is with organizations that are Islamists, that were indicted in America because it was connected with American organization, the Council of American Islamic Relations, that were indicted for terrorist activity. So where is the due diligence have been done? You have the mayor of the Calgary right now. I think she may be totally innocent, but has a due diligence been done that it was before 9/11, the worst terrorist act was planned and executed out of Canada that led to the assassination of the Indian Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi, and the bombing of Air India 747, all done out of Canada. And here we have our ministers and our politicians running into these temples and gurdwaras where they support and they wave the flag of Khalistan, that is independent Sikh land in India. You have the leader of the NDP in Canada, which I understand, who cannot get a visa to go to India.
This is illuminating. Yeah, this is illuminating and shocking.
So again, in a nutshell, to put it in a very nutshell, North America, going all the way back to whenever you want to go back, 1776, 1867, or whatever earlier date and antecedent, was supposed to be, in a way, a refuge of Europeans from the wars of religion to come here, begin a new life over here, and leave the baggage of the problems back in the old world, not to bring the baggage of the old world into the new world. That was the whole idea. That's the principle. Well, what has multiculturalism done? It has brought all the old quarrels of the old world into the new world, into Canada, into the United States. I mean, we went through the 30 years of warfare in Sri Lanka, fought out in Canadian soil. We're going through the entire situation of the Muslim world, engaged on Canadian soil, on American soil, and European soil.
Well, this is, there can be no question based on what you've said and what we know that there has been an infiltration of this globalist agenda deep into Canadian society. However, there are signs of hope, aren't there? You talked about the situation in Italy where a new leader has been elected, has been described as the Italian Margaret Thatcher. That's a sign of hope that perhaps nationalism in the positive sense, love of country, love of God, love of culture, is an antidote to this globalism. And I want to turn now to your recent tour, speaking engagement through BC. If you don't mind, I want to read a little bit from an email that you sent to me about your impressions and then get you to talk about it a little bit. This is taken from your email that you sent. You said it will take time for me to sort out the experience of these 2 weeks on the road and the people I got to meet and spend time hearing their views about the country and how the lockdowns and mask vaccine mandates of the past 2 years and counting have affected their lives. I want to put in writing my first impressions while fresh in my mind, the extent to which I have rediscovered the vastness and beauty of our country, how much excited I have become with the possibility of change and renewal in Canadian politics due to developments once again in Alberta. Despite the alienation, anger, and frustration of so many in the Western provinces with Ottawa, there is an abundance of energy among the people I met who now seem resolutely committed to redress the imbalances of Canadian Federation that people in the East have so blatantly and for so long arrogantly ignored. So that sounds very hopeful. What was it about your speaking tour through BC and Alberta that you found so encouraging and so inspiring, Salim?
Well, first of all, the people that I met, and especially people in the interior, in the small towns like Spruceview, Alberta, I didn't even know that it existed. Or in the interior of BC, places like Trail, BC, or Grand Forks, BC, and the people I met there, apart from the big city, Edmonton and Calgary and Kelowna and so on, was how much the people were awakened and aware of the situation in the world, how much they were concerned about the impact of what is happening in the world coming to their backyard and affecting them and their way of life, the woke culture in schools, and that is happening. Simply put, the entire absurdity, which now we cannot talk about in fear of being, somehow, of course, being politically incorrect, but be faced with government persecuting you or bringing indictments against the person doing that. Things like a man can be a woman, a man can menstruate and be pregnant, and so on and so forth. Children are being given such education. And these was really, for me, the light, in a sense, that people are far more aware, where the society is more cohesive, where people can talk freely. And so in the interior, people are sitting and having these conversations in Tim Hortons and what have you, that people are not open and in that sense reticent to engage in large cities because they don't know who they're talking to, who's going to overhear them, and so on and so forth. So that was very refreshing, and that's something that encouraged me with that thought, that it is in places like Alberta that this awakening that is taking place or has already advanced quite a bit, that a new reform agenda for Canada can be born and can take shape. Then I learned about the Albertan situation, and I met with Pastor Arthur Pulaski, and I met with a whole lot of people involved with the Alberta Prosperity Project and the Independence Party of Alberta. And that triggered in me the thought that, in some ways, again, the movement that IPA represents, I saw it as a rebirth of what began in late 1980s, But of course, there are differences, and the most fundamental difference in this sense is the context. We are now completely in a different situation from where we were in the 1980s. And that makes the situation even far more interesting in the sense that the Albertan push for independence, were it to occur, will have a huge impact for the rest of Canada. But even if it were not to occur, the very fact that this is going to be discussed, if they win the election and if a referendum is brought about with a full awareness and knowledge and understanding of the Clarity Act of 2000, what Albertans cannot be denied is what has been already conceded to Quebec. And when all of this hits, the rubber hits the road, so to speak, this will have, again, a profound effect. A conversation will take place in Canada, a conversation that should have happened when the Conservatives were in power in 2006 to 2015, and that Mr. Harper and his cabinet of Western conservative basically jettisoned, and there was no reason given for jettisoning it,
Mm-hmm.
So that conversation will happen, and that conversation hopefully will lead to a greater demand for the reform of our existing constitution, institutional arrangement, the imbalances and asymmetry that exists. We are run out of central Canada, but more importantly, we are simply run out of Montreal, Ottawa, and Toronto,
Mm-hmm.
With double majorities. You as an Albertan know that very well. It is for the
Mm-hmm.
rest of Canada to say that if you're going to keep this country together, we then have to address these positions. And if we don't address these situations, then Alberta will likely go. Yeah. And finally, I mean, going through the interior of Alberta, for the first time, saw for myself the extent and the width of oil wells in Alberta. We talk about it simply fly over country, but right there, going through, and so many of them sitting idle. The world is thirsty for what Alberta has. And yet, this again, just like multiculturalism, the whole climate change scam is a deliberate demolition of the hydrocarbon economy globally. And of course, in Canada, the target and therefore the weight of the cost that this scam has brought about is being paid by the Albertans, even though the Albertan has been carrying the load. In my quick observation, there's Alberta and then Ontario, but Alberta leads by far Ontario, even though Ontario's population is more than twice the population of Alberta. Alberta leads by far in terms of equalization payment that Alberta contributes to Ottawa. And yet Alberta has been penalized in a manner for which there is no logical, rational, historical, even moral, ethical case to be made.
I really like the way you frame that, because one of the things that I think is misunderstood by Central Canada about the tag Western alienation is that fundamentally, if you think of the APP, it is not a separatist movement. What it is it is a rejection of the globalist ideology that you've been talking about. Right. And I happen to think that that's the main reason why it's come under such severe attack. It's what the late Dr. Roger Scruton described as oikophilia, which is a love of home. This is fundamentally right. What, if you want to call the Alberta independence movement, it's really an Alberta preservation movement. And it's also a preservation of the best of Canada. What Albertans are saying is, we want to preserve this part of the world in which we've lived. We want to preserve the conditions and the values under which we've lived. And we're not just talking about white Albertans, we're talking about every Albertan, of every region, every culture. Because as you say so profoundly, and it's so true, when we look at different cultures, divergent cultures in that sense, we're talking about cultural enrichment, not cultural appropriation. And that's really, it's the richness, as you say, this multiple ethnicity. That's the richness of culture. That's the richness of Alberta. And that's the richness of Canada. That's what made Canada and the US and the West really different, was embracing all the best of these different cultures. And that's what we've lost. That's what's under attack under this global agenda, isn't it?
Well, you put it very well. I mean, remember when President Trump, as Donald Trump, came down his tower in 2015 to announce his candidacy, he said, "Merry Christmas. We're going to say Merry Christmas." It's as simple as that. Now, those who don't want to say Merry Christmas, that's perfectly fine. But you're not going to, take away Merry Christmas from those especially the majority of the people who celebrate Christmas, and who wish to keep celebrating, and turn it into some sort of an offense against people who are not Christian and don't want to say Merry Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, we Canadians of diverse backgrounds have made our home in Canada. It was done before the centennial year, and it is continuing after the centennial year. But what it seems to we have lost since the centennial year is the pride in the founding culture of Canada, the very culture that makes it a home for people from around the world to find their own refuge and their own growth and their own prosperity within the cradle of the Canadian culture or the American culture. And it is time, well beyond the time, for Canadians, and especially for those who feel the loss at the gut level, at the emotional level, at the historical level, to throw aside all of the political correctness that has been imposed upon them, to choke them. I used Liu Xiaobo, who was the Chinese Nobel Prize winner, but a prisoner of conscience and died in prison a few years ago. His words that, freedom of speech is the mother of all freedoms.
Mm-hmm.
Or as Elias Canetti, another Nobel Prize winner in literature and a survivor of the Holocaust, said in his wonderful book, Crowds and Power, that the act of breathing is the act of freedom, and by that he meant, if you're going to choke me, suffocate me, that is my death, which is, of course, was in a sense trivialized and totally made nonsensical by the Black Lives Matter, Antifa, George Floyd movement, totally miscast and abused. But this is it. I mean, Canada and United States at its core are the two unique cultures coming out of Europe that is founded upon or based upon, in that sense, freedom. And freedom means ultimately nothing else unless it is about individual freedom. The ultimate minority is the individual. And a good society, in that Lockean sense, is a society that respects and protects the individual. But if it becomes a matter of multicultural, then the individual fades away. It becomes collectivist. And then we have protected people about whom we cannot discuss anything. The moment we discuss anything about that class of protected people, then we are slammed with the argument or with the vilification and allegation that we are racists and bigots and so on and so forth.
Sadly, and ironically, it seems today that the most oppressed minority is the individual. Well, Professor Salim, this has just been an incredible conversation. So much insight, so much wisdom, and I'm so grateful to have had the opportunity to sit down with you in this way. I know we've just scratched the surface. We're just staring at the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg of your mind, but we've been able to extract some real gems today, and I'm so pleased by that. This is the part of the program when we turn to something called the reading list, and it probably won't shock you to learn that two of your books are featured today. The first one is called Islam's Predicament. And the publisher's description here is that Islam's Predicament brings together Dr. Mansur's most important essays written over the last decade, previously published in various journals and media, starting with The War Within Islam. He then goes on to 3 Muslim perspectives of Danish cartoons, Muslim rage and the Bedouin state of mind, Muslim on Muslim violence, keeping faith in the age of Islamist terror, and much more. The second book that you've talked about today is the one I believe that was published in 2011, The Delectable Lie, A Liberal Repudiation of Multiculturalism. And from the book, there's this quotation: "My point is that although multiculturalism once seemed a very good idea, or at least to politicians and others smitten with the ambition for unity, is increasingly shown to be a lie, a delectable lie perhaps, yet a lie nevertheless that is destructive of the West's liberal democratic heritage, tradition, and values based on individual rights and freedoms." So I'm recommending those books strongly. I've only started reading the first one, to be honest. I'm going to read both of them. But can you point the people taking in this podcast to other resources, other books that you would recommend to advance their understanding of the things that you've been talking about today with us?
Well, I would add my last book, The Quran Problem. I think, that's it.
Great.
And it has a bibliography that is I have put together for anybody that wants to go further in the discussions that I have raised in this book, because the issue of Islam is today, Islam and Muslim is today in our world one of the hottest topics. I mean, they not run away from it, and it is the hottest topic. And I think people need to be informed in a sense in which it is not demonized. It is taken into account that there are differences and there are commonalities, and particularly to my Christian friends, not to take the theological argument as the kernel or the essence of what is, beyond theology. Theology is a human construct. I used to tell my students, and I still say, theology is advocacy. Lawyers engage in advocacy, so whichever side an individual is, a lawyer can be both a defense counsel and a prosecuting counsel, depending upon what role he is playing. And same with theologians, it is an advocacy thing. One has to really go into the comparative historical understanding of these subject matter. And Muslims don't worship Muhammad. Muslims worship God, the God of Abraham. The three religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, in that sense, are part of the Abrahamic tradition. Theologians might differ in their understandings, and they might put out their own views upon this. That's perfectly okay. There's nothing to be offended about it, but it is like, for instance, saying Mr. A has this opinion and Mr. B has that opinion and Mr. C has that opinion. But none of us know what is God's opinion, and if someone says, well, I know what is God's opinion, well, so be it, that is, again, the understanding that person brings as if he is the spokesman for God. And we leave it at that because it's a matter of faith. It is not a matter, again, as I say, of science or logical discussion. One cannot prove nor disprove what one believes in.
Well, thank you so much for that. I'm going to recommend strongly all three of those books. They're added to our reading list. And once again, Salim, we want to thank you so much for being with us today on Grey Matter. We've taken a lot of your time, but it's been well worthwhile. I think anyone listening to this or watching it is going to benefit greatly from your wisdom and your knowledge. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today on Grey Matter.
Well, thank you, Leighton. I mean, it's been a pleasure to be with you. And if I am in Edmonton sometime, I will take the opportunity to call upon you.
Oh, I look forward to it.